In the year 2024, whenever I think about Susan Strong, I think about her Season 8 resurgence, starting with Preboot and ending in Islands. And since this era of the character is pretty clearly superior to everything that came before, something you'll hear my full thoughts on later this summer, it's kind of easy to forget that the character originally served a much different purpose in the show before being brought back. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Since I'm currently working on a video going through all of Islands, as well as the Susan parts of Preboot and Reboot, I thought it was worth it to take the time to break down all the stuff with the character that came before. So get ready for a pretty loose video, as we talk everything there is to talk about Susan's first 3 appearances, including both the progression of the character, as well as how her existence reflects upon Finn.
No, we won't eat Red Stripe Man, only everyone else.
As far as I can remember, I'm pretty sure I've never extensively talked about an episode from Adventure Time's first 2 seasons. So before getting to Susan's title quarter hour, let's go ahead and establish a few things that makes talking about this episode a little bit different than talking about one from the latter half of the show. For starters, pretty much every single character, including Susan, acts like a goofier version of their eventual selves. For example, throughout this entire episode, Bubblegum's sole character trait is being a naive princess scientist, who doesn't seem to realize how innocent and useless her people are, something the character canonically understood hundreds of years before this moment. And while some of this can be explained as Finn being much younger, and therefore everybody in this episode interacting with somebody who's much younger, as tough as it might be to stomach, and this is coming from somebody who quite likes a good chunk of early AT, it's just a different show with different goals. On a related note, a similar thing that will more so affect this discussion of this particular episode is the fact that, on a pretty consistent basis, the show does things that would be much bigger deals if they happened in like season 6 or 7, but here are pretty clearly just gags or things meant to move the plot a little bit. So while stuff like Susan being able to pick up English remarkably quickly, or the episode's borderline uncomfortable allusions with Finn trying to civilize Susan's people could be interpreted as the episode trying to make some kind of statement, I'm not gonna be the one to make that leap. Anyway, to finally get into the episode, unlike the other 2 quarter hours that I'll talk about today, this one has surprisingly little to say about its title character, especially if you filter out all of the things that the show decided they didn't want to stick with. Once you remove all of the wild animal stuff, the only thing this episode leaves you knowing about Susan is that she is probably a fish person who is definitely the leader of a bunch of other fish people who live in the sewers. And while I do promise that the title of this video wasn't entirely a lie, since I'll never again get another chance, and it is somewhat related, we are gonna have to take some time to talk about this episode's portrayal of Finn, as we see him really struggle with being the last human for the first time in the show. And while there are some awkward segments in this plot, such as PB deciding to randomly bring up his trauma for no reason seconds before he discovers the humans with a Y, I really do love how they depict Finn immediately grasping on to the first trace of fellow humanity, and feeling this sense of responsibility to do anything he can for them. This episode definitely could have gone in the direction of Finn's non-human friends being jealous of this newfound kinship, but they instead chose to focus on the really weird feelings that Finn has when interacting with a group of people with none of the same experiences as him, yet still give him a never-before-felt sense of belonging. It's just genuinely one of the neatest concepts that the first 50 or so episodes cover, letting us explore the less fun side of being the only human in a magical world, as even while showing Susan things like marshmallows and singing songs about how happy he is to have another human in his life, There's this sense of impending dread in Finn, something that bubbles up when Susan and her friends threaten his way of life, and something that bursts when he learns that everybody, including seemingly Susan, was never actually human at all. All of the sudden, Finn goes from thinking that he's finally found some human brethren to being alone once again. And not even Candy People shenanigans can take away from this moment. Something that culminates in perhaps my favorite interaction of the first 2 seasons.
Do you think she was human or just another wild animal?
We're all wild animals, brother.
Yeah, I guess we are, brother.
When this conversation is written out like it is in the script, this moment seems like Finn coming to the conclusion that he'll eventually settle on, which is that the species of the people that he surrounds himself with doesn't really matter, and that he'll never be as close with a human as he is with the friends and family who raised him. But as I hope that copyright let me play, the audio during this moment portrays a much more solemn agreement from Finn, as he either doesn't quite believe it yet, or just finds the entire discussion upsetting to think about. His entire world has now shifted twice in what appears to just be a day or two, and it's left him just unable to engage in Jake-style wisdom, reflecting on whether or not he'll ever be able to meet people like him, or if those people even exist. And while it is really fun to psychoanalyze a character who still hasn't turned 13 yet, if I don't actually talk about Susan, I'm going to have to retitle this video. And there is more of this type of Finn retrospection to come, so let's go ahead and get to the episode that really established the character of Susan.
Finn? Help, Susan!
Of course I will.
In more ways than one, Beautopia truly excels at being a follow-up to its main character's title episode, as it turns Susan from an object that Finn's humanity questions revolve around to an actual character. A character that Finn's humanity questions revolve around. Seriously though, from the very first scene, this episode immediately establishes both its dark atmosphere, as the group's fire serves as the only source of light, as well as its darker tone, as Susan enters this episode completely desperate for help. Throughout this entire quarter hour, there are parallels between Finn's desire to help Susan and her desire to help her people, something that's reflected in Susan's constant admiration and attempts to replicate Finn's ability to face fear, or as she refers to it, his hero heart. These two characters' dynamic works really well to carry this episode, as Finn showcases that his innate desire to be helpful isn't at all dismayed by his belief that Susan is probably a fish person, and Susan showcases that, even though she actually knows that she's not the same species as everybody else around her, that she's willing to do whatever it takes to get them the help they need. And also, Jake is here. Seriously though, and this is only barely relevant enough to mention in this video, but Jake's portrayal here, while funny, although never as funny as this Susan line,
Oh, good! Still got some bolt left.
just never quite makes enough sense. I get the idea of him being against Susan for what she did, but it's just written in such a weird way. Maybe this plot would work if there wasn't a huge track record of Jake befriending people before and after this point who were much weirder things than fish people and did much worse things than ignorantly try to eat the citizens of the Candy Kingdom, but as it stands, everything involving Jake that isn't a hilarious gag just doesn't really land in this one. Anyway, back to the good stuff. Something to keep in mind when watching this episode is that, given the fact that she's not brought back for nearly 3 years, I think it's pretty safe to say that this episode was written to possibly be Susan's last appearance, something that actually makes a good amount of sense. While there are a bunch of great sequences and memorable moments here, the entire episode really revolves around 2 different parallel moments, as our 2 humans discover the other's lack of gills, with the result of Finn's search being hidden from the audience, this, although the result was a bit more than obvious even at the time. And besides these moments just being really well done emotional beats, thank you Rebecca Sugar, I think they also do a really good job, despite these interactions being between two humans, emphasizing the theme of your relationships with others not solely being based on commonality. As even though as the audience we don't know that Finn and Susan are for sure the same thing, we do know that they for sure care about each other, and that's all that really matters. Season 3 of Adventure Time is generally regarded as the point in the show where things start to shift in a less goofy direction, and I think this episode does a good job showcasing this, as while the bulk of it is goofy Susan and Jake shenanigans, the emotional core is still pretty damn present. While I am ultimately glad that this wasn't the last we saw of Susan, as her best stuff in the show is still to come, if this was it for the character, I think I would still be pretty satisfied, as we leave her in a really good place, set to lead the people of Beautopia into a new era.
For you see...
Dark Purple is one of the weirdest episodes in the weirdest season of the show, in pretty much every way imaginable. For starters, even just structurally, this one is pretty odd. Towards the beginning of the episode, in the Finn, Jake, BMO, and Marcy plot that more or less serves as a frame story, Jake makes a joke about the typical structure of an Adventure Time episode, as he describes the group investigating something, finding out a freaky truth, having a big fight, and saving the day. This kind of comment is something that's admittedly not that out of place in the most meta season of the show, but what is quite odd is that the next 10 minutes play out exactly how Jake described, except without the climatic fight, as the episode just kind of ends. It just feels so off, and it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all of the different things that makes this episode weird to talk about. Actually getting into things though, besides the aforementioned frame-ish story, the only actual character in this one is Susan, as we easily get our best look at the character yet. In general, when looking at this episode, it's hard to not see it as serving its main purpose of setting up Susan for her Season 8 journey, something I'd argue it does pretty well. For starters, besides just reminding the audience of her existence, this episode decides to remove the intrigue from her last appearance and confirm that she is indeed human, just a human with a little bit of a cyborg thing going on. This is a decision that I've spent a good amount of time thinking about, as the obvious thing would be to wait until pre-boot to reveal this fact in front of both the audience and Finn at the same time, but at the end of the day, I don't really think that they had a choice. If they were going to do a Susan episode before Season 8, they had to reveal something about the character. And given the fact that they didn't want to spoil the existence of the island humans, this is about all they could do. In retrospect, this isn't something that has a huge effect on either this or any other episode of the show, but instead just a weird writing quirk of Adventure Time's unfortunately necessary season by season approach. Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff that you could touch on here, from one of Adventure Time's least subtle pieces of societal commentary to the fact that Susan appears to not entirely be in control of her people, setting up the idea that she might not want to live in Beautopia forever. But what I really want to focus on is how, especially thematically, the show sets up Susan's backstory that we won't learn for another 2 seasons. When looked at in a macro sense, and ignoring all of the weird soda cult stuff, what Susan does in this episode is decide that, despite hundreds of years of tradition, that it's not worth it to let a system that hurts people continue. Something that she attributes to her newly acquired hero heart, and something that we later learn that she failed to do without it. There are a couple more parallels between Super Porp and the society society that Susan grew up in, including the fact that children were immediately indoctrinated into the system, as it's clear that the Susan of today, especially after meeting Finn, would have handled that situation differently. The Susan Strong that we've gotten to watch develop just couldn't bear to watch this type of organization continue, which makes it all the more tragic that, even though she's forgotten it, she was a part of an organization that did all of this on a much larger scale. Overall, while it is slightly more dissectable upon a post-series viewing, Dark Purple is an interesting twist or character turn away from not being kind of forgettable. But I do think that, through some fairly clever writing, it accomplishes its goal of bringing Susan back into the show, setting up one of my favorite stories that the franchise ever tells.
Fly like an eagle.
Besides a quick appearance in the musical, where she sings a song about persevering through pain, something that she pretty clearly does a couple dozen episodes later, that's the last we see of Susan before she gets a much expanded role. Speaking of which, as I've probably mentioned only 2 or 3 or 20 times, this video was made out of a desire to have something to point to when I talk about the Susan stuff that starts in Preboot. So in an attempt to actually do that, I won't make this conclusion too terribly full of things I'll end up repeating in a month or two. Instead, I want to focus the last bit of this video on talking about how these 3 episodes more or less represent Adventure Time's general philosophy towards these early season side characters that, because of the show going on for much longer than anybody anticipated, end up being repurposed to mixed results. Some characters, like Lemongrab, are given new stories that are similar to their original purpose, as he goes from forcing PB to be responsible by threatening her throne, to forcing PB to be responsible by being one of her most damaging creations. On the other hand, some characters, like Flame Princess, never really find a role in the show outside of their initial purpose, as she goes from being Finn's first girlfriend to a princess with daddy issues who likes to rap. But for some, like Susan, the show is able to breathe life into characters who were barely even characters before, something that we begin to see hints of by the end of Dark Purple. In Susan's title episode, her entire existence is to just give Finn a glimpse into a world where other humans exist. In Beautopia, she's given a bit of room to actually develop, watching Finn's bravery and using it to inspire her own. And by Dark Purple, the show feels comfortable enough to surround her with essentially silent sidekicks, something that fully establishes her as a character worth investing in. Even though I've spent over 8 hours talking about Adventure Time on this channel, I'll be the first to tell you that this franchise isn't perfect. But it really is massively impressive how they take somebody like Susan, who was clearly only meant to be in 1 or 2 episodes, and set her up for an arc that, in a mini-series focused on the show's biggest mystery, still shines through. Anyway, that's about it for me. Apologies if this video wasn't exactly the most cohesive, but I knew that I needed to talk about Susan for like 20 minutes before getting to her appearance in Islands, and that it was probably a bit too off topic to put in that video. If you want to see updates about that eventual Islands video, or you just want to see me talk about stuff in a non-scripted and usually worse way, you can find my Twitter hidden away in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with a video on a different tall woman. Thanks for watching.